Hello, my name is Brooklyn Joles, and this is my research presentation. And for my topic, I chose to do microbiology and fermentation of food and beer. I basically just wanted to do a deep dive into the science behind fermentation of food and drinks. And I chose to do this because I work in a bar while I'm in school, so I do have a little bit of knowledge about the fermentation process with beer, but I did want to do like a deep dive and learn more about it just because I thought it would be cool to think about that more because I can use it in school and apply it to science and also apply it to work and gain more knowledge that way too. So diving into my first slide, I just wanted to do an overview of what fermentation is, what the definition of fermentation is. And the definition is fermentation is the process of chemical breakdown of a substance by bacteria, yeast, or other microorganisms, typically involving effervescence and the giving off of heat. The science of fermentation is actually called zymology or zymurgy. Sugars and basically carbohydrates are transformed into a new product, creating different foods and drinks that we all know. In my next slide, I'm going to tell you exactly what foods and drinks there are so you can kind of recognize what I'm talking about. So carrying it into the next slide, I'm going to talk about what food and drinks are fermented so you kind of have an idea about that, what you know to look for. Many foods that we know and love are fermented. Some of the food products that are fermented include bread, kimchi, miso soup, yogurt, and cheese. There are a bunch of foods that are fermented. You can really ferment any kind of food if you know how to do it correctly. You can do like any vegetables or any food that you really want to do that with. And we can also think fermentation for beer and wine. So that's where we get into the two different types of fermentation. We have the lactic acid process and the alcoholic fermentation process. And I'll dive into exactly what both of those processes are and how they're different. And I also wanted to include some photos of some food and drinks that you might recognize that are made from the fermentation process. The first picture, we have a whole lineup of some recognizable beers that are made from the fermentation process. That is made from the alcoholic fermentation process. And then we have the wine glass on the next picture. And wine is fermented using grapes. That is also the alcoholic fermentation process. And then we have the cheese. The cheese is fermented using lactic acid, so it's part of the lactic acid fermentation process. We'll get into more of the differences between the two in the next few slides. And then we have miso soup, which is one things that's kind of on its own. It's not really in a category, but it is fermented. Same thing with kimchi. It's one of those things that's just kind of like its own thing rather than in a subgroup like beer, wine, cheese. And then we have sourdough bread, which is also fermented. So now I'm going to get into why you should eat or consume fermented products, or why you should ferment food if you want to do that. Fermented foods have many benefits to the human body. Consuming fermented products promote a mix of good and bad bacteria in your intestinal tract. It enhances your digestive process. It improves the availability of nutrients and may improve mood and behavior. I did see something online where it said that the two scientific names I have listed have been found in fermented food, and they may improve anxiety and depression. Besides health benefits, many fermented foods are delicious. They have their own kind of taste about them. I mean, we all really like pickles and stuff like that. It's kind of like a sour taste like pickles, although pickles are kind of like a different process than fermentation. And then on the next slide, I'm going to dive into the two different types of fermentation processes. So starting with the lactic acid fermentation process, it's basically just the process where a bacteria breaks down sugars in food and produces lactic acid. And lactic acid can help you do a lot of things. It's good for your body. And then on the next slide, I'll explain how it's good for your body. So as a result of it changing the sugars and carbohydrates into lactic acid, the lactic acid is helpful because a lot of the lactic acid can be pulled into other things. So lactic acid is added to a lot of food products to promote longevity on shelves in grocery stores because it can suppress and kill harmful bacteria. It also helps us by consuming lactic acid for fermented foods because it can provide us energy. Now talking about alcoholic fermentation. Alcoholic fermentation is also known as ethanol fermentation. It is the process where sugars are converted into cellular energy in the cytosol of microorganisms like yeast. So this is why you hear like beers are super yeasty or they have a lot of like a thickness to them. It's because of the yeast. And I have a little visual of basically like a summary of the whole process of fermentation, a visual of that, because you can go so deep into that with all of the chemical names and micro organisms. And although we think of alcohol and the bad associations that come with it, like liver damage and bad behavior, there's actually some probiotics involved in the alcoholic fermentation process. Just like the lactic acid fermentation process, we can get some of those benefits like improvement of immune function and digestive systems, like how our digestive systems run. And just with the lactic acid too, it does promote the mix of good and bad bacteria so that your digestive tract can be healthy. So basically, to conclude, I'm going to talk about the definition of fermentation and why it is a good thing and kind of go over that a little bit. Fermentation is basically the process of chemical breakdown of a substance by a bacteria, yeast, or other microorganisms, typically involving effervescence and the giving off of heat. And this produces food products and alcoholic beverages when you ferment food. So you basically have to do that process on your own. It is something that can be naturally occurring, but a lot of the things that we consume and we recognize as fermented foods and drinks are done by, like, are man-made. And there's many benefits to the human body from fermentation, from the process of fermentation, like an increase in good bacteria in the gut, protection against diabetes has been shown in some studies, and many more probiotics being added to your diet that you maybe wouldn't have got if you didn't consume something that was fermented. And so this is my sources page. This is basically just where I got a lot of the information that I learned doing this presentation. And this is the end of my presentation.